Hi, and welcome to Progressive Short Takes. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And the question we ask in this short take is why can't we handle the pandemic and the Green New Deal at the same time? Recently, an article appeared in Truth Out. It was written by Alexis Goldstein. And the title of that article, which I'll share with you right now, is the U.S. is missing a chance to tackle the climate crisis and pandemic relief together. And Alexis published this in Truth Out on October 20th, 2020. She points out the crisis has exacerbated, that is the pandemic crisis, has exacerbated existing inequalities and has been an abject lesson in what happens when nations don't prepare in advance for a catastrophe. Yes, we were extremely unprepared for this catastrophe. It has also led many to draw the comparison between this health crisis and the ongoing climate crisis and the growing and urgent need to tackle climate change now before it spirals out of control. And Alexis is certainly right about that. And she goes on and says that we continue to lead the world in COVID-19 infections, and we've taken the opposite approach. We've rolled back environmental protections, including many during the pandemic, giving tax breaks to polluters, and withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. Even the ostensibly politically independent Federal Reserve is overinvesting in fossil fuels in one of its economic response programs. By contrast, the EU is taking these dual crises seriously, combining its pandemic response with work to also blunt the coming climate crisis. In September, the European Commission, the EC, the governing body of the EU, announced a massive new green bond program. As a part of its ongoing pandemic recovery this coming January, the European Commission will sell bonds in order to raise 750 billion euros, or $857 billion, dollar equivalents, of course. This EU recovery fund will distribute its funds among the countries and sectors in the EU most impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. About 30% of the bonds, 225 billion euros, they plan to sell will be sustainable green bonds. These bonds will back projects related to tackling climate change. This will not only make the EU the largest issuer of green bonds, it will effectively double the size of the international market for sustainable financial products, as the total of all the green securities sold globally last year was 274.2 billion, according to Bloomberg. As highlighted by the NGO Reclaim Finance, what is considered a green bond, quote unquote, can vary significantly, and a recent report from the Bank for International Settlements found that green bond projects haven't necessarily translated into comparatively low or falling carbon emissions. In order to clarify what it considers green, quote unquote, the EU developed a green taxonomy that acts as a screening criteria for economic activities, looking at what can make a substantial contribution to the mitigation of climate change or adaptation while avoiding significant harm to the environment. Including green bonds in the EU Recovery Fund is hardly the first ambitious climate initiative the EU has pursued. The European Green Deal is a 10-year, €1 trillion proposal that aims to make the EU climate neutral in 2050. By the way, that's pathetic. It should be doing it by 2030. But of course, it's not pathetic compared to the United States, which is going in the other direction entirely. While ambitious in many respects, the Green Deal has faced criticism for its support for natural gas and its failure to address subsidies for coal, with others criticizing it for being an exercise in reshuffling money that will only generate 7.5 billion euros in new budget commitments over 7 years. The EC itself has estimated that Europe would need 260 billion euros annually in order to achieve its 2030 climate and energy targets. The Green Deal only allocates 100 billion euros a year, but the scale and scope of its effort remains far more than what the United States has pursued. So there's more on this aspect of things, but she goes on to say, one of the principles some central banks have adhered to when they take action to boost financial markets is that they should not be picking winners and losers in particular industries, but instead should be, quote, market neutral, unquote. The U.S.'s central bank, the Federal Reserve, has faced criticism not just for failing to be market neutral, but for being more heavily invested in bonds from fossil fuel companies than the rest of the market is, as recently noted in a report from the House Select Committee, subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis. One of the economic rescue programs the Fed has launched during the pandemic is one that buys the corporate debt of companies. But more than 10% of the Fed's bond purchases are fossil fuel companies, even though fossil fuel firms only employ 2% of all workers employed by firms in the S&P Standard & Poor's 1500 stock market index. This is in spite of the terrible financial track record oil and gas companies have and the history of polluting communities of color across the United States, such as was done to Detroit by the Marathon company. They're a petroleum company in Detroit. And the European central bankers, meanwhile, are considering moving in the opposite future-forward direction by asking whether central banks should pursue market neutrality at all, given their responsibility to boost green industries that will help ensure a livable world in the face of accelerating climate change. And so Europe, specifically the European Central Bank, may consider factoring in climate risk when it decides to purchase for any future stimulus. As the frequency of wildfires, also disasters, and extreme weather increases as the climate crisis accelerates, so too do the financial risks governments and private businesses alike face. A disaster cleanup is costly, and as Graham Steele of the Stanford Business School and Greg Gelzinis of the Center for American Progress have argued, climate change is a threat to global financial stability. These risks should be priced into the cost of all financial securities, from insurance contracts to stocks and oil companies like Exxon, but they haven't been. This failure of the market to account for these risks was also noted in a September 28th speech by European Central Bank Executive Board member Isabel Schnabel. Schnabel, like the chairperson of the European Central Bank, by Christine Lagarde. Is she the chairperson of that or the IMF? I forget. Let me look back in the article she's mentioned earlier, but I skipped over that. Let's see. She used to be the head of the IMF. She may still be the head of the IMF. No, she's now the European Central Bank president. So she is the ECB president. So there we are. Anyway, Schnabel Lagarde, noted that being market neutral may not be the appropriate benchmark, quote unquote, because markets aren't factoring in the cost of climate change. And she argued they ought to do that, that there needs to be collective action by both governments and central banks. The Fed has shown no such urgency, and the Trump administration, which has been nakedly working to boost oil and gas firms while gutting environmental protections, has no interest in a green bonds program. So, in other words, we can't handle both crises at once as long as Trump is in office. In fact, apparently, we cannot handle either crisis because we certainly aren't handling the COVID-19 crisis very well, with so many of our people dying. And we know that we're working against handling the climate crisis now because the administration is running the other way as fast as its little legs can carry them. I should say its little legs and its fat bellies. But should Joe Biden win in November, we will likely see a shift in priorities. Biden has pledged to invest $2 trillion in green infrastructure, clean energy. He has, and that is a 4-year program, so it's $500 billion a year, a considerable amount, but nowhere near necessary. Bernie Sanders' program was $16.2 trillion over 10 years, an average expenditure of $1.6 trillion per year. Market analysts have noted that this significant funding could come through green bonds. It could also be achieved through a coordinated national investment in sustainable projects. And the U.S. should look to Europe for inspiration on the scale of the EU Green Deal while being responsive to and addressing criticisms from the left that the EU deal has faced. But the Fed, independent of Congress and the president, could act right now, and the Fed has shown some willingness to explore how it can do more to tackle systemic economic problems. 3 regional Fed banks are currently hosting a 7-part conference series discussing the economic implications of structural racism in the United States and ways to address them. At a minimum, the Fed should consider ways that its purchases of $315 million in bonds of fossil fuel firms, including those with a track record of environmental racism, are exacerbating the problem. But were Fed Chair Jerome Powell willing to act in accordance with his past statement that he will act to ensure that the financial system is resilient and robust against the risks of climate change, unquote, he would follow the lead of the European Central Bank. It's time for the Fed to join the European Central Bank in acknowledging the inherent financial risks that climate change brings and to ensure that the securities the Fed buys to boost the economy are done with climate risk in mind. And to end the article and comment very briefly but significantly upon it, if we moved to handle the Green New Deal and the pandemic crisis at one and the same time and in relation to one another, then what we would do first is to pass a healthcare program that would provide healthcare for the pandemic on a Medicare for all basis to everybody. That would be something that would be a key supplement to the Green New Deal and at the same time would help to handle the climate crisis. So that ends this progressive short take. I'll be back shortly with another one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon.